Hi everybody. I am going to talk about something that is very close to my heart. It's also something that I may or may not suffer from. The first thing that I'll talk about is ADHD. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Also there's attention deficit disorder, ADD. And there's other things that I'd like to talk about as well. One of them being the drugs that are used for treatment. So there are a number of drugs that are used for treatment. Some are Strattera, that's a non-stimulant version. There's also some natural stimulants that you can take, like the ricin family of B vitamins, which can have stimulating properties. And then there's also the traditional treatments. The problem that I found, I was misdiagnosed, or I don't know if misdiagnosed is the right word, maybe properly diagnosed could be the answer, with ADHD when I was a child. The problem with that diagnosis is I also have complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, or just PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So in my case, I don't know how accurate that clinical diagnosis was, and I've never really had a proper diagnosis since. And I've never been in a stable environment long enough where anything like, maybe I just sit too much and I don't exercise, so I'm hyperactive because I don't get enough exercise or other things, could clear that up and provide evidence for why I am not necessarily ADHD. But let's just look at this for a moment, though. There are a number of side effects. Historically, one of the most dangerous aspects of the stimulant drugs. Examples of stimulant drugs are ephedrins. So you look at drugs such as dexedrine, which is commonly used, Ritalin. There's a few others. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head. I've taken quite a few when I was in high school. Long-lasting, other things. They have horrible side effects. I had difficulty sleeping and other things. They have some perks, but and I won't get into those for the fact that this is a G-rated video. But there are a great number of side effects to them. Some good, mostly bad. People don't really talk about these. People don't realize that their kids... See, this is what will happen. You have teachers. And this is where I found a lot of the problem is that there's a dysfunctional relationship in the educational system where people don't know how to help students who have issues, such as ADHD. It's true that if you tend to talk a lot, you need to have sort of a separated world. You need to have something that will interest the person. I found science to be really interesting to me, along with history, and I could hyper-focus on it. And this is sort of the cultural aspect. There are things that make ADHD harder or easier. I think that culturally there are certain aspects to our culture, certain things that tend to be extraordinarily interesting. What about them? I'm not really sure. I think some things are extraordinarily interesting and they help keep you focused. The other thing I found is that I'm very good at lectures. I don't know if that's a tendency of people with ADHD, where they tend to be very auditory or audiovisual, and as a result of that, they have difficulties reading. I have a great difficulty reading at times because my brain is constantly generating stuff. It's not that I can't focus, it's that literally I will pose questions in my mind as I'm going along, and they'll just instantaneously come up. Like, well, what about this? So say I'm reading about, what would it be? Okay, so for example, say I'm reading my chemistry book, and it's talking about quantum theory, or quantum entanglement, or I think in the case it was talking about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, when it was describing the development of quantum physics into describing the quantum model of the atom, and that was specifically in reference to, let me see, the quantum theory of the atom, Heisenberg uncertainty principle, quantum mechanics, the sort of the history behind that. And it had this very interesting section in there talking about how the Heisenberg uncertainty principle was an experimental principle. And my mind got all crazy because it was like, wait a minute, it's an experimental principle, which means that it's a result of our inability to measure without influencing the experiment. So without, basically, if you're trying to detect the motion of an electron, you're going to shoot a photon at it, and by shoot or some, you're shooting something at it, a photon or whatnot. And when you shoot the particle at it, you change the energy state of the electron. You alter its direction, you alter a whole bunch of crap. The point, though, is that I thought in my mind, well, what about a passive system of measurement? So I thought, okay, well, again, this is all while reading this section. My mind starts producing these things in itself. So it starts saying, well, what about the what about if it being passive? So I think, well, what about sonar? You have sonar that is a passive system. Because, again, a lot of science is about figuring out really creative solutions in order to measure things. So if you have a problem with, say, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, the question becomes, well, is it possible that the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is merely just an experimental problem and that there could be some creative solution to overcome it? Now, of course, when you try to talk to your prof about it, they're very dogmatic and they'll tell you, no, well, mine did. Barry, Dr. Allen, was very dogmatic and he told me no. But this is what happens to me. You get off on these sort of tangents. And it makes focusing very difficult when I try to read. Now, I don't know if that's ADHD. It may not be. It may just be that I have a very overactive mind. And I tend to think laterally, and I think about a lot of different stuff. And, well, also being linear. But other things, though. I mean, it's just generally how our culture deals with it. In schools, teachers don't want kids who are going to ask questions like that, who are going to have difficulties focusing, who are going to be popping their hand up every 5 minutes asking questions. And here's the thing. That seems to me, if you have students like that, they're really interesting to teach. They are. But they don't work well in a standard classroom setting when it's just read and wrote and I'm going to give you the information and you're just going to suck it up, because they are actually going to argue with you. They're going to be the student who's going to stand up and saying, no, you have to prove that to me. Yeah, I know, it took me to college and getting in philosophy and critical reasoning and logic before I found out. No, actually what I want is my professor to give me enough justification to prove to me, to an extent, why it is that this is true. Now, does that mean I want a formal proof every time? Not always, but yeah, in a lot of cases it does. And I have to understand the proof, and I have to accept the proof, and there's a ton of time and energy that goes into that. And I need all the extraneous details, and you have to explain it to me in class, because on my own, I'm going to be producing so much information. I'm going to be aggregating so much data. I'm going to be going through crap. I'm going to be running back and forth at 5,000 miles an hour that I'm going to have an extreme difficulty focusing on this little pinpoint for more than 5 seconds. Is that ADHD? It could be. I've taken pills for it, and it helps. The problem is it also puts my brain in a vice grip. And I think for a lot of kids, that's a huge problem. That's where I think my mom comes up with the idea of, you'll see kids on these drugs and they literally act like zombies. Because they'll get into a classroom situation and, oh yeah, they can do the work and they just sit there, but their mind literally is off. They're just completely incapacitated. And I think for some people, like, one of my friends that I know, she has, well, it depends on what you want to define it as, higher level autism or Asperger's or whatnot. It is a disorder that makes it difficult for her to relate to other people. And she says the medication she takes actually helps her. If it's something that you as an adult recognize that you need help with, I think that's totally fine. But I think first and foremost, before anybody I don't think those drugs should be given to kids. And my dad, indoctrinated me with that as a kid, and I've come to believe it's true after exposure and after my own personal experiences. The drugs are really dangerous, and I don't think we should be giving kids stuff that's extremely dangerous while they're developing. Who the hell knows what it'll do to you? I mean, all the tests they've done on these drugs have created just vast quantities of data which show that it's dangerous. And it will destroy your liver, and it can destroy your heart, and it can destroy a ton of your body's organs, just basically wearing them out, and just because your metabolism speeds up, and it can cause insomnia, and you'll have sleeping disorders, and just, which I experienced. And that's not something you want to have kids who already have a number of other problems that they're going through try to deal with. Because then you start getting into things, well, should we give kids downers, or, do we have to give them more melatonin, or what's the deal? And people with ADHD, they tend to have problems sleeping and stuff. I mean, I think giving kids melatonin, if that helps, is probably fine. I'm not a doctor. I don't know a ton on the research on it, but I've heard that they've been giving kids melatonin because light tends to cause problems. We live in an artificial society with artificial lighting and things. No, we don't live in we live in a society with artificial lighting, which causes a lot of problems. It can screw up sleep cycles and other stuff. But anyway, based on that, kids tend to get into problems because of that. And I think that if you're one of those people who has troubles sleeping, and has troubles talking, and has troubles forming social relationships because of that, that's a huge problem for our society. It says that there's something wrong with us. I mean, it's not that there is. It's not what's wrong with a person. It's just that, when you're telling a fourth grader that they have to take drugs, what does that say about the kid? It tells them that they're bad, there's something wrong with them, they're different, and because they're different, they're somehow bad. And because you want to fit them into the system, as opposed to making the system fit them, difference is bad. And that's something I've experienced in my life. If you're different, if you have different ways of learning, different thoughts, different thought processes, you're bad. If you find a good teacher, that's not as big of a problem. But kids who are like me, we have a great difficulty learning in a normal environment. I mean, again, let me backtrack and say, not normal. In functioning in our society's schooling system as it presently operates, I do not function well in it. And I have troubles believing that I'm the only person. I also think, based on my experiences and my own knowledge and learning of education and how it works and a lot of the systems behind it, we're actually hurting ourselves as a society because of that. And this is sort of where I'm going to get into the efforts of people in our society to change that attitude. And a lot of it comes down to what I've talked about before, being a social narrative, or the attitudes that your society has. How does our society view ourselves? So if you look at, say, like Japan, okay, these kids, they're important in the society. If you look at places like Finland, kids are crucially important in the society. Their success in education, their success in their schooling is critically important in the society. Now, sometimes that creates abstract pressure. Japan has a huge problem with pressure, because they have a limited number of spaces at the good universities, and everybody's being pushed at an excessive level to do well. And the result of that being kids, then go into college, and they just, excuse my language, but fuck off. And that's known to be the case in Japan, is that they'll work all through high school and be incredibly driven, and then they'll get into college, and all of a sudden they just all fuck off. And it's kind of cultural, which is interesting, but it's what happens in Japan. Finland, they don't push them like that. They're a lot more, I guess you'd say, loose and mellow about it. And because of that, it has had some great benefits. So I was watching this TED Talk a while back, and I, irrespective of the background of TED and what people think about it and other things, I've heard both ways. I've read some things and heard, it tends to be an elitist organization, other things. But that's not really relevant for what I'm talking about, though. So whatever your opinions on TED is, put that aside. The discussion, though, is, I don't remember the lady's name, but she was talking about autism. And my first impression, listening to it is, I got defensive because I felt to myself that as someone with ADHD, because, I have ADHD and I don't really accept that I have it because I just want to be able to succeed without having to take pills. I want to be able to be successful and to do the things that I desire to do and study the things that I desire to do and not have things that I have to overcome. I know, isn't that lovely? I want life to be easy, and it's not. So, that set aside, I found that this discussion talking about differences, it was interesting to me. She talked about how, in her mind, certain parts of her brain, I think it was like her visual cortex or something, certain parts of her mind was extraordinarily overdeveloped. So like certain pathways in her brain were overdeveloped. And as a result of that, it causes her to think differently. So she has troubles dealing with a lot of other stuff, but she's very good in certain areas. It's the visual, spatial, or other things. I've got a lot of stuff I'm good at. But the problem is, it's how does your society view that? We think that if you're not just the pre-built normal human, you're bad. But then at the same time, we say that, okay, well, if only autistic people can be good at these certain things, then everybody else is at a deficit. And our society is trying to fit everything into a box and everybody into a set little circle, square, peg, whatever hole, and value everybody. Your IQ values you, your test scores, your GPA, everything says something about you that you don't have a lot of control over. Do you think you really have a lot of control over your GPA? You really don't. At the end of the day, you could work as hard as you possibly could and go to every class and do every assignment. And that's what I was taught to do. If you have any problems, go to your profs and other things. But this isn't the 50s. This isn't when my grandfather taught in the 50s and 60s. Our society doesn't have it, where if you do really well and you try really hard, there are going to be people there who are going to teach you how to do it, and you're going to just succeed, and then you're going to get a good grade because your grade represents the effort and the completeness of the program, and if you have troubles and you struggle some, and it's going to take you longer, they give you more time, and so on and so forth. That's not how the system works. And people who think that's how the system works are deceiving themselves. And it frustrates me because I run around day after day after day focused on this, excessively focused on our education system because of my own life experiences. People don't seem to give a rat's ass how damaging it is to ourselves, to our futures. How we value ourselves in our society is crucially important. If we think to ourselves that because I'm emotionally off a little bit, because say I have an odd intelligence, it's too high, it's too low, it's whatever, I'm outside of the norm. We think that everybody should be a rocket scientist, everybody should be a genius, everybody wants to have the highest IQ. Okay, fine. That's, if you think that IQ is really saying something, but I don't know. I don't really know. And I've heard arguments that, that IQ could be relational to, what they're talking about with IQ could be that people are autistic. What they expect to be this grand high IQ is really a form of autism. And again, that's back and forth. One side's insulting the other side. And I guess that's maybe where I think people just need to chill the hell out. That's why I like Rick Riordan's fantasy novels. They're written for middle schoolers, which, it's like any middle school book, okay? The Harry Potter series was written for middle schoolers, about to start with. Most of it is, although some of it, towards the end, she gets a little crazy and she starts killing characters and stuff, and it gets pretty gory and graphic, and then even she says, I wouldn't give this to my kids. But that aside, Percy Jackson has the protagonist of the story as a teenage boy who is 12, who has family problems, whose mother's married to this just total jerk, and he's always being put in these schools, and he's always having troubles, and he's getting kicked out every year because he's always having some bad catastrophe happen to him. And I actually know the feeling. I would have gotten kicked out of school if it hadn't been for the fact my dad is an asshole. I love him for it. In a lot of ways, my dad, he fought the system for me. That's what he's good at, fighting the system. But the problem is, you don't survive in a bureaucratic system for a long time without creating a lot of enemies. And our system is just screwed. It's got so many flaws to it. And it's learning how to deal with the system. Learning how to cope with it functionally. That's something I had a lot of problems. I went to therapy for a long time, and my therapist talked about dealing with the system functionally. You can try to change the system, you can fight the system, and hope that the system will change while you're trying to go through it. But if you fight the system while you're trying to go through it, you're going to always be struggling. And she talked about a friend of hers who was trying to, he was trying to become either a medical doctor or, or he was trying to become a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And he was trying to fix the system while he was going through it. And the result was he was pissing everybody off. So it took him forever to go through all these stages, and he never got through it. And I guess her message to me was supposed to be like, if you're constantly trying to change the system while you're in it, you're never going to get through it. So you have to prioritize and say, okay, go through the system and then fix the system. But the problem I've encountered is so often the people who do that, as soon as they get through the system, they're saying, oh great, I'm done with the system, I don't have to deal with it anymore. But when you're in the system, it's confronting you every single day. So that's kind of the problem you're at. You can either confront the system while you're in the system, or you can try to come back and do it later. It's like my dad talks about, going to school, after you get a job. If you try to do advanced education later, so often people don't, because they'll go through it once, they'll get done with it, it'll be such bullshit and crap, they'll go off into the real world, as it's noted, they'll get a job, and then all of a sudden they'll go off and do something else. They'll do their job, they'll have fun with it, and then they won't bother with any higher education. So the idea is that, no, you have to get your higher education first, because if you don't, then you probably won't get it later. Now, is that always the case? No, I don't think it's always the case. I think sometimes people go out and recognize the value of it and then come back and get it later. And sometimes you need a break. But does that mean that it's like, the Occupy movement, fighting stuff. So anyway, but Riordan, he does something very interesting, which is that he looked at his own son. He created the Percy Jackson saga, along with the other series that came after it, originally based on his son. Now, his son used to hide under his desk and had difficulties in school because he had autism. Sorry, not autism. He had ADHD and he had dyslexia. And based on that, he had troubles in school. He couldn't read very well, and he'd hide under his desk, hide under their kitchen table. So, but he was interested in ancient Greek myth. So, his dad, Rick Riordan, went and started telling his son these stories, myths, ancient Greek myths, and they've got all kinds of interesting things in them. You've got the heroes and the fighting and all of the stuff going on that helps keep a kid focused. And I don't think it's that everybody necessarily needs that. I think these stories are interesting for a lot of different people, but I think for somebody who has an overactive mind, which is really probably the best, in some ways, the best way to describe an ADHD person. They talk about it being a problem with dopamine receptors, but they really don't, there's not really a good description of it. Do you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? There's not really a good description of what causes attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They don't really know. It's kind of like, why do antidepressants help you? Well, they have sort of cobbled together a model that might sort of help explain why it works, but on the grand macro scale, they don't have a clue. The same thing is with ADHD. And I go back to Plato and Aristotle. Sometimes it's the sort of intuitive answer that you seem to find in, the old Greek philosophy that sometimes has the best description, because you try to get extraordinarily technical and you can't. So that said, maybe these kids, or as my dad, and my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation would say, some people are just hyperactive, and maybe you exercise them more. What did they find? They found that exercise helps people with ADHD. Well, if you have this model description that says there's some problem with the dopamine receptors and there's such and such, well, exercise would help because it speeds up your metabolism. It's also just good for you in general. So if you have a hyperactive person, maybe they need to burn off some steam. Is that really the answer? I don't know. It might be. Or it might also be the case that it means that the kid needs to be engaged a little bit more. If they have troubles reading certain books, then maybe it's not that they have to, it's not necessarily that they have to read it in a traditional way. I found that when something is really interesting to me, I want to read it. But I tend to aggregate a lot of stuff. Okay, so that just means that you're real bright, right? Yes, no? See, again, it's a problem. Is the person bright? Are they dysfunctional? What how do you define them and describe them? And our society would say, oh, it's not that you're bright, it's that you have problems. You need to take stimulants. You need to take something to slow your brain down and make you fit into the box. And that's a problem. When our society takes that viewpoint, it makes other people devalue themselves. I devalued myself because I didn't fit into the box. And it was struggling. It was frustrating. And now I'm coming to accept, no, I'm just different. So what I have to do is find people who are like me. And I think in an education system, parents who have kids who have really strong problems, problems being they don't fit into the system and they struggle. Does that mean that a person with dyslexia can't read? No. Shit, I've got a cousin with dyslexia, an uncle with dyslexia, and he loves fantasy novels. Actually, he's the one who got my mother into fantasy novels, which got me into fantasy novels. Now, do I read as much as I should? No, because I've got issues with PTSD and fear. Which again, do I live in a society that is a fear-mongering society? Yes. Does my world feel safe? No. Should I read more? Yes. But again, why do people who have overly stimulated minds, I think even middle school kids, even that age group, I think, and even adults, people need a lot of stimulation. And we get our stimulation through things like television. Why? Because it activates all of our senses. So in traditional schools, maybe we need to look at teaching students in a way that engages them. You talk about engaging students. What does that mean? There's not really a good definition for it. So maybe we need to find one. If myth and story and action and adventure, or in my case, when I deal with math. Why do I like ancient Greek mathematics? Well, I like them because I've studied a lot about it. So you get into things like history. Why is the history important? Because it's interesting. And you get into these classroom situations with school, and you have these very linearly minded people. And you people are fine. You're cool. You all have your value, just like I have mine. And they don't function very well without, when someone says, I want to get to my job. So, okay, everybody wants to get out of school and they want to get to their job. Well, fuck that. Excuse my language, but fuck that. You're going to school to get schooling, training, but also to get a lot of other things. And if the problem is that going to school, the end result is to get a good job so you can make a lot of money, there's a huge problem with our society right there. Because that says that our society is running on a production mode, a production model. And at the end of the day, we're going to run out of things to produce, we're going to run out of natural resources, and eventually we're going to all die from overpopulation or from just overproduction. Eventually, we need to get to the point where we recognize that going to school and getting an education for the sake of getting an education, a good one, helps us down the road by making better choices. And sometimes those choices are the models we make. You don't have to go to school to get a great, general, broad education. Just to get a job. It's not about getting a job. It's about being a better human being. And that's a huge problem we have in this country. We think that going to school is all about a paycheck. It's not. Your education helps you, but mostly it helps you in, if it's a good one, it helps you in indirect ways. There's the training that you need and the certain, tool sets, but above that, it's all general stuff. And the more you have, the better off you are. Now, if you're going into a job that's very small, very structured, and they only want exacting specifications and they want a specific tool set, fine. But realize something. That isn't about innovation. That's not about doing your job better or having an employee who is capable of doing a lot of different things and does their job really well. All they're looking for is a cog to fit a machine. Because that's how our system functions. We have specialists who come in and do certain tasks and move on. And they specialize in doing one task. And if you look at history, that goes back to the Henry Ford, and even before then, it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Does the Industrial Revolution, does this idea of fitting the cog, fitting the square peg into the square hole, or sometimes it feels like the square peg into the round hole, or the round peg into the square hole, which can fit, but isn't a good match. Should you be doing that? That's a problem. Is that what our society should be focusing on? I don't know that. But I think for this problem of ADHD and of classification of people, we need to look at where we're coming from and where do these definitions come from? And why are we so hyper-focused on it? You know? I mean, if you want to use that same terminology, why are we so hyper-focused on the differences in people? Well, it's inherent to humans. We tend to do that. Okay, so we want to make everybody the same. Is that a good idea? Just think about that to yourself. Is making everybody the same good? I don't think it is. I like being different. But you got to respect difference. And that's something we do really poorly too. So anyway, I'm going to end this video, and it's probably going to be a series now, I'm guessing, because of the time. Yeah, shit, it's almost 2 20-minute videos. I don't know how I'm going to post them, but again, when I look at Rick Riordan's books, and this is sort of what it ended up being purposed as, his series are very engaging, and they've got comedy and action, adventure, and mystery, and all these other things. And what's interesting, though, is his protagonist. He makes his protagonist be a good guy, but also a little outside the norm. And he comes up with a very reasonable explanation for why he's outside the norm. Why does he have ADHD, and why does he have dyslexia? Well, it's because he's actually a demigod, and he actually needs these different things for very rational reasons. Now, you could say that maybe those differences are disorders, and maybe that we all should be the same, or maybe you could take the view that maybe he's right. Maybe there are advantages to having ADHD. What could positively influence ADHD? Why would you want it? Nobody seems to ask that. When is ADHD a good thing? When is autism a good thing? When does it help society? When is it beneficial? We only look at ADHD as being a bad thing. And that goes back to the same thing. All differences are bad. You want everything to be the same. Is that
a vast virus database has been updated?
Is that a rational way of looking at the world? And I don't think it is. The interesting thing, though, about that is that in his series, you've got the Kane Chronicles, and you've got his sort of Greek, Roman, whatever myth. Both of these all exist in the same universe, but they're looked at differently. What's interesting, though, is that when you look at the Kane Chronicles, the kids have their own set of issues. All of these kids have issues. Some parent, of course, Greek mythology. Parents aren't married. 2 different parents. All, sort of unusual home life. All kinds of different things. And what it ends up doing is it makes it that being different is okay. And just because your family may be a little screwed up, or there's monsters trying to kill you, or whatever, you can still be a good, functional person. And a good person. And in the Kane Chronicles, it's the same thing. His parents are dead, and then there's all these weird things going on. And it makes it okay for the protagonists, to be who they are. And they have to overcome things, and they have to mature, but it's all right for them to be who they are. Yet in our society, we say that's not okay. You have to take you have to take the meds. You have to do these things. Sometimes, some of these disorders are, or even if you don't want to call them disorders, these mental whatevers, have really detrimental things that can come with them, that are detrimental to yourself. And not just like detrimental to dealing with society, but they cause some really big problems. That's when you have to sort of look at it and say, okay, is this something that is manageable through other things, like with ADHD? I have troubles because of how I, interact, and maybe it's the case that since I operate a certain way, maybe I need to have my information presented to me in a certain way. So, it might be good for everybody. Sometimes the idea is that, certain people need it presented in a certain way. And if you're one of those people, maybe, you can't have it be good for everybody, but sometimes you find by studying these I won't call them an abnormality, but these phenomenon that don't fit the model that you have, sometimes the way you look at them actually is beneficial to everybody else. Because if you need to make the subject matter more interesting, maybe it's a general thing, like, it would be helpful to everybody. So in my case, I do really well when I work with other students while studying something. And you'd say, okay, well, you have troubles motivating yourself to do things on your own for long periods of time. But when you sit down tutoring with other kids and working with other students after a lecture and going through the stuff together, you tend to do well on it. Okay, well, why is it that it's different when you do that? And then there's other people, then there's the other people who say, I can't work with anybody, I have to do it alone. I tend to talk a lot, but I do better in groups. Some people do better in groups. Then there's people who have to do it themselves and can't have any distractions and are very noise sensitive and have to be by themselves when they study. And I think you have to figure out who's like that. And it's important because if people do have these very different dynamical differences, maybe we have to change even the course structure. Because maybe some people actually need to fit in for certain studying in different groups. And then just interact normally with everybody. But say, okay, well, so maybe there are some learners who literally need to be in this group class, in this environment where they study more things and they have more stuff going on. And some people just don't learn very well in that. And they need to, it's the idea of some people need the broad perspective and some people need the micro perspective, looking at specific examples first and then talking about the general theory. And some people need the historical introduction and then they need to look at specific case examples and they need to sort of get both sides. And then it can be discipline specific, and there's all kinds of things that go into this. But the average teacher, God, this is overwhelming for them. There's so much out there that they have not been prepared for, and they don't know how to deal with it, and they freak out. And you also have the people who go into teaching who just want a job. So you've got, on one side, you have the teachers who do want to teach, but are overwhelmed. And then on the other side, you have the teachers who don't give a crap and are there just for a paycheck. Then you also have all kinds of others in between. And you might have some who do know how to do it. That rare teacher who really gives a crap and can teach really well. You see what I mean? There's so much going on here. And it's really frustrating. At least it's frustrating for me, and I think it is for a lot of students. And for me, this is something that as a society, we need to really focus on and learn to deal with. Looking at ADHD, looking at these different mental... We need to look at these different methods the mind works and accept there's differences and not judge people because of it. And as a society, we do, especially in the educational system. And I'm not going to call it the educational system, but that's what society calls it. In reality, it's the schooling system. School is not the same thing as getting an education. You can get schooling and not necessarily get an education, which teaches you how to deal with the world. It teaches you how to navigate the world in which you live in order to best deal with it. Schooling is a type of social training. It's where you get introduced to social narrative, you get discipline, you get other things. It's where your society is doing certain things to you based on its social narrative, meaning the things that it values, the gods that it serves, so on and so forth. And as a result of that, it can be an educational experience or not, it can have educational experiences, provide opportunities for educational experiences, but that doesn't necessarily mean you'll get one when you actually go to school. So anyway, that's my rant. I hope this 40-minute whatever has been valuable for you, this discussion, and please let me know. Thanks again.